Sage of the Shadows, where dark whispers echo through the night.
Audio story, Blood Twins. Chapter 10, Currents Beneath the Oath. The iron gates of the estate groaned open with a reluctant creak, the sound echoing across the desolate grounds like a warning. The squad stepped into the courtyard, their silence heavy with the weight of the confrontation ahead. In front of them, the manor loomed, its facade towering beneath a sky smothered by rolling gray clouds. The house was as foreboding as Arina remembered, its sharp edges softened only by the glimmer of light seeping through the high, wide windows. Arina lingered at the back of the group, her sharp blue eyes darting between the imposing walls and the distant tree line, tracing every potential escape route. Beneath her cloak, her fingers grazed the hidden documents, a reminder of her own agenda. This is hostile ground, she thought, her unease only deepened by the heavy stillness. As they advanced, the unnerving sensation of being watched crept into her bones. Arina's gaze flicked toward the shadows between the trees, her pulse quickening. There, lurking just beyond the reach of the flickering light, figures moved with a fluid grace. She couldn't make out their details from this distance, but the unnatural stillness told her all she needed to know. Vampires. Watching, measuring. Her breath hitched ever so slightly, a tightening knot forming in her chest. Arina's pulse drummed in her ears, each beat a reminder that she was intruding on territory she was never meant to occupy. With a subtle shift, her fingers tightened around the hilt of the dagger at her side, though she made no move to draw it. She couldn't afford to show weakness. The vampires watched in eerie silence, as though waiting for a sign, an excuse to make their next move. Inside, the grand hall opened into a familiar expanse of stark opulence. At the far end of the hall stood Rylan and Lysara together with Erica. They were poised near the stone hearth, where a fire smoldered faintly. Its light played across their faces, exaggerating the sharpness of their features and highlighting the austere line of their postures. Even now, the quiet hum of vampire energy surrounded the room, a distant but palpable reminder of the power that flowed through the very walls. Arina stood at the back of the group, her senses hyper-aware of the dangers lurking just beyond the visible. She could almost feel the weight of their eyes, pressing down on her like an invisible chain. This was no longer just a place of hostile politics, it was a place of power. Her gaze flickered to Togi, noting the tension in his shoulders. The manor, the people, everything here was a warning. 3 days. Rylan's voice cut through the silence, low and sharp. He didn't shout, he didn't need to. His piercing green eyes swept over the group before settling on his son. 3 days without a word, and you return with chaos following in your wake. Togi's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch under the weight of his father's anger. We weren't careless, he said, his tone measured but firm. The hunters were organizing faster than we anticipated. Waiting for their first move would have been a death sentence, for us and for anyone caught in their path. Rylan's glare didn't soften. He turned his sharp gaze on the rest of the squad. And you all agreed to this? Did none of you consider the consequences? The ripple effects of this audacity? Corvin leaned casually against a pillar. His expression was one of boredom, though his emerald eyes gleamed with defiance. Oh, we considered it, he drawled. And we decided getting rid of a few hunters was worth the risk. You should be thanking us. We bought this city time. Time? Rylan's voice was a venomous whisper. He took a step forward, his imposing figure casting a long shadow over the group. Do you think this is a game? That the lives you've taken won't demand retribution? You've drawn the gaze of every surviving hunter, not just on yourselves but on all of us. And what would you have done? Arina's voice sliced through the rising tension like a cold wind. Waited, hidden behind these walls until the hunters found your doorstep? You think you're protecting your people by staying passive, but all you're doing is delaying the inevitable. Rylan's eyes locked onto her, his expression hardening further. And you think you understand this city better than I do, outsider? His tone was icy, dismissive. You don't know the balance we've worked to maintain. What you and my son have done is reckless and selfish. Arina's jaw clenched, but she stood her ground. I know what happens when you do nothing, she countered, her voice low but laced with conviction. We acted because waiting wasn't an option. The room fell into a tense silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound. Lysara, who had remained quiet until now, finally stepped forward. Her auburn hair gleamed in the firelight, her mismatched eyes, one blue, one brown, fixing on Arina with unsettling intensity. You speak with boldness, Arina, she said, her voice softer but no less commanding than her husband's. But boldness alone doesn't save lives. Tell me, do you have a plan for what comes next? Arina's lips pressed into a thin line, but before she could respond, Erica's voice broke the silence. Maybe she doesn't, she said. But you can't deny she's right about one thing. The hunters weren't going to wait forever. We needed to act. She turned her gaze to her brother, her expression conflicted. Even if I don't agree with his methods all the time, Togi did what he thought was necessary. Rylan's eyes narrowed as he looked at his daughter. And you support this? He asked, his tone sharp. I didn't say that, Erica replied, her voice steady despite the tension. But pretending the hunters aren't a threat just because we want to keep the peace won't work anymore. The world doesn't care about our balance, father. It's changing, whether we're ready or not. The weight of her words hung in the air, the room teetering on the edge of conflict and uneasy resolution. Rylan's lips pressed into a thin line, his piercing gaze shifting between Erica and Togi. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of unspoken words settling heavily between them. You're defending him? Rylan's voice was quieter now, but the underlying anger was sharper, more dangerous. After everything his impulsiveness has cost us? Erica didn't waver, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. I'm saying he made a difficult choice when no one else would. And for once, it wasn't out of pride or defiance. It was to protect us. Lysara's expression unreadable as she studied Erica's face. You believe this? She asked softly, her voice a thread of calm in the storm. I do, Erica replied firmly, her eyes not leaving her father's. You always say we need to adapt to survive. This was an adaptation, a preemptive strike to keep the hunters off balance. Rylan's fists unclenched slowly, but the hard set of his jaw remained. He turned his attention back to Togi, his voice now heavy with exhaustion rather than fury. Do you understand the position you've put us in? This city is already on edge. Your actions, no matter the reasoning, risk exposing us all. I do understand, Togi said, his voice steady but tinged with regret. And I won't apologize for trying to keep us alive. I agree, Arina interjected, her voice sharp but measured. Her blue eyes locked with Rylan's once more. You can call it arrogance or defiance, but the truth is that doing nothing would have cost you more than this fight ever will. Rylan's expression didn't soften, but something shifted in his stance, a grudging acknowledgement, if not acceptance. Lysara placed a hand on his arm, her mismatched eyes glinting with quiet understanding. What's done is done, Lysara said, her tone brokering no argument. We can't change the past, only prepare for what's to come. And the hunters will come. We must be ready. A tense silence followed her words, the unspoken agreement hanging heavy in the air. Rylan finally exhaled, the sound more a growl than a sigh. Very well, he said, his voice low but resolute. We'll deal with the fallout. Erica exchanged a glance with Arina, her expression a mix of gratitude and wariness. The tension in the room remained thick, but the immediate threat of an eruption had passed. Lysara's gaze shifted to Arina as well, appraising and calculating. And you've proven yourself capable, if nothing else. Perhaps it's time we consider an alliance. Arina's eyes narrowed. An alliance? Join us, Lysara said simply. You've shown your worth, and your skills would be an asset. Working together would be in everyone's best interest. The hunters are a threat to us all. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Arina's response came after a long, tense pause. No, she said, her tone final. Her blue eyes burned with quiet determination. I have my own matters to attend to. I won't stay here longer than I need to. Rylan's eyes narrowed at her words, but his face betrayed little emotion, though the undercurrent of disappointment was clear. I don't make offers like this lightly, he said, his tone calm but edged with a hint of menace. Remember, Arina, this city can break even the most steadfast of individuals. You'll learn that sooner or later. Arina met his gaze, unfazed, her chin tilted upward in defiance. I'll handle it, she said, her voice unwavering, before turning her attention back to Togi. Take care of your family, Togi, she added quietly, her tone softer for a moment. The door closed behind her with a heavy thud as she left. The night was thick with tension as Arina walked away, her cloak trailing behind her like an extension of the darkness itself. The cold air seemed to close in around her as she moved with quiet purpose, the weight of the confrontation still lingering in her mind. Togi's soft call broke the silence, a sound that seemed out of place in the heavy atmosphere. Arina. His voice was quiet, yet urgent, carrying an undercurrent of something more. She turned, her expression unreadable. The light from the manor flickered over her face, but it was impossible to discern her thoughts. Thanks, he said, his words genuine, for what you said in there. She smiled, there was something softer, a hint of respect, maybe, or an acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them, however fleeting. Togi hesitated. He wasn't sure what he expected from her, but this was different. The uncertainty lingered in his chest, tightening like a knot. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a slip of paper, offering it to her with an almost hesitant gesture. Here, he said, his voice lower now. My number. In case you need anything. Arina took the paper wordlessly, tucking it into her cloak without a glance at it, and without another word, she turned back toward the forest. You're still planning to leave, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as though he were trying to convince himself more than asking her. I am, she replied simply, her voice steady. I have to. Togi nodded, a complicated expression crossing his face as he tried to process the reality of the situation. Be careful, he said, his tone heavy with concern. This city, it has a way of pulling people under. I'll manage, she said, the certainty in her voice unmistakable, but there was something else too, an unspoken distance, a resolve to remain on her own path. She stepped back into the shadows, vanishing from his sight as though she had never been there. The sound of her footsteps faded, leaving nothing but the whisper of wind in the trees. Togi stood motionless for a moment, his gaze lingering on the spot where she had disappeared. With a single glance at the guard stationed nearby, he gave a silent, unspoken order. The guard moved immediately, his steps purposeful as he silently trailed after her, blending into the night. As Togi watched the guard fade into the distance, his thoughts swirled in a disorienting haze. With a troubled sigh, Togi turned back toward the manor. The coldness of the night seemed to follow him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his story, and hers, were far from over.